I have finished up the Bash version of our projections, and this is the result. I just wanted to show you a little bit of how I organize my Photoshop files, and for some of these, I try to keep this pretty nice and tidy, and group things into folders and label them so that it becomes less of a mess. And I think here you come up against two different kind of Photoshop organization methodologies. One that typical concept artists will do, where it's usually you look at their Photoshop files and it's like a big giant mess um, of layers and all kinds of stuff, and maybe a bunch of stuff's flattened and that kind of stuff. Matte painting should not be that way. You're working on these larger projects. They need to be organized in the Photoshop file, and they all need to be separate. So all these different elements I have are separate so that I can adjust them later, And like I said, I've got groups nested inside of groups, and so that way I can go back and, adjust. Here you see the original image coming through, and if I need to adjust something later, I have that information still there. So keeping things non-destructive. If I were adjusting the color in any of these, which I haven't actually had to do quite yet, just for this bash, I would be putting adjustment layers within each of these folders. So there's the two different kinds of keeping things separate. I'm keeping all these things separate because I want to have control over the paint on these, and because you don't want to come back and somebody to say, oh, okay, this is working, except we need a whole new ground texture, and you're like, okay, I'm going to go down to my ground texture and replace it out. But if you have everything collapsed together and it's all flattened, then you'd actually have to go through here and lasso it out and do a bunch of extra work. So keeping things separate like this and within folders saves you a lot of time, and later down the road, and helps you to be able to adjust things on the fly and do them quickly. And then so that's one reason to keep things separate. The other reason to keep things separate is that sometimes things are projected separately, like this cross right here. This cross will be projected separately onto a piece of geometry with a whole different shader. So everything out here so far will get one shader, and then this cross will get another shader, so that you don't get this cross doubling onto this geometry back here. So that's another reason to keep things separate. And if I felt the need, like that this church should be separate from this stuff, and I see that there's a big movement between those, that's not a problem for me because it is separate, and I just save it out to a new file separately. So that's another reason why keep things organized, keep things separate, and so that you can project separately. So let's take a look at this other projection. It's the same basic thing. I've got this cross and this, different things broken up into all the different elements that I'm using. So so same basic structure. I usually put a ref folder at the top where it's just all of my reference images, if that be extra photos that I want to keep track of, or things that I'm trying to color match or whatever. But usually I turn those on when necessary. But everything else, I keep those nice and tidy. So let's, now that we have our projection images together, let's jump to Maya and start projecting these and see how they line up with the geometry that we have. So here is our Maya file, and we can start. Let's go to our perspective. We can start breaking these things up of where I intended the different projections to go. So we can start assigning that to the geometry. Let's go ahead and hide these guys, since we will not be projecting, these projections won't be projecting on those. All right, and then let's go ahead and create a new projection shader that will be off of our hero projection. Select that, assign that in there, and then let's pick an image that is going to be our projection image. You can see here it's what we saved out of Photoshop without the sky, because the sky needs to be on something separate. It can't be within this projection. So all this without the sky, and you can tell that the cross is not there. It's because I have the cross in a separate file that will be projected from the same camera but using a different shader. So let's go ahead and select that. Say yes to the alpha channels. Our little thumbnail preview is in there. So let's go ahead and select what we want to project on. So I think our line is going to be about right there. And not those guys. All right, so that is going to be our geometry. Let's go ahead and assign that. All right, so that is now assigned. Let's take a look at our thing here. Yeah, so you can see that there's some problems with the geometry aligning over here. That's pretty far off. And so some of it's spot on, because I, like on this one, I was a little more careful about where the stairs hit. Over here you can see that the stairs don't hit very well at all and don't conform to what the image has. So those will all have to be adjusted. And you can see my cross here is getting that texture. So we just need to create a new shader just for that cross. So let's go back here, look through our projection camera, select it, pop it in there. Select our cross geometry there and assign our cross texture there. So now you see we have, let's look through our shot camera. So now you see we've got the cross on a separate piece from everything else, and that seems to be working. It looks like this guy didn't get assigned, so let's go back and assign him there. So now he's showing up right there. So yeah, so that seems to be working. We can now go to our other projection, this guy here, and assign him. Let's create a new shader, network, and select this guy, and our image is going to be this guy that has everything in it here. Say yes. And then let's go ahead and select the geometry that we are going to use to project onto. Let's go ahead and assign that. All right, so we can see here's a really good example of why things need to be broken out separately. I broke this out separately for this cross, but I didn't do that for this gravestone. And you can see the result of the gravestone just smearing, absolutely smearing all the way across the ground, and very undesirable. But we can see some of this stuff working. Let me just make sure I've got the right texture in there. Yes, I do, but it is guys. Make sure all this stuff gets assigned to that. So yeah, it's starting to come together, and this is where I'd be working out which geometry gets assigned to which shader. And it's possible to layer up the shaders so that you create a layered shader. For what we're doing, I don't necessarily think that that's necessary because I've in the projections I pretty well set out that which things will be on which projection. The only thing that I can think of that would need like a layered shader is the ground, because there's a piece, as you can see, the piece of ground here that's in this shader, and and then there's the piece of ground that's in this shader right there. So we would have to eventually do a little alpha so that these two textures on the ground live together. But everything else I think should probably be fine because I have, this object being in one projection and these objects in another projection. So we can go more into that when we get to that point. But now that we have our scene and we're looking at it, we can start going through and modifying the geometry to match better the projections. So like for instance, I have this curved, in the projection I made a decision to make a flat wall come out, and this is like a curved wall. So this is where I would be going through here and making some modifications to the geometry so that it lines up better with the projections. And so when it's easy to tell, like this here, I can tell that this is where the wall turns. So I just move this geometry up there to be about right there, and you can see that that lines up pretty well. And then we lift this guy up right there, and you can see on this wall, this is where the image would be corrected to match the geometry, because the perspective on this image right here kind of goes down a little bit. And so in Photoshop, I'd want to grab the edge of this wall and bump it up so that it lines up with this here. So I can see here that I need to create some more geometry. And as long as I'm duplicating existing geometry, then it stays within the shader. So I don't have to keep reassigning the same shader over and over again. All I need to do is just duplicate something that's already in the existing shader. So let's go out here. Start to describe this surface just a little bit better. So that's where it goes there. Duplicate that guy. Back. Let's get rid of that old piece of geometry there. And it looks like that's about where it turns right there. So yeah, so you can see how I'm shaping the geometry to work. That's a piece of old stuff. Go ahead and delete that. This is the difference now. Now your geometry is becoming projection geometry, which is different from the reference geometry that it was before. So now that you better align these things up, then it becomes your projection geometry. You can see here on the ground how this curb just smears across the ground, and it has absolutely no dimension to it. And like when you get back, it looks fine from like right here, but then if the camera moves, you can see how it goes, it flattens out completely. So we need to put a piece of geometry there so that it catches it. So let's duplicate this guy. Just turn him on its side there. And go ahead and extrude some of these faces. So that's getting better. Just make sure geometry gets pushed back all the way to that wall. I'm not really concerned with nice geometry, or that the geometry is penetrating other geometry. That's completely fine in terms of what you can get away with projections. It doesn't have to be really great. And that's not even very high res on this. Probably for the final, I'll want to go through here and put in a little edge loop just so it's not so stair-steppy on the geometry. So like right there, that is sufficient for projection geometry right there, which is very light, and you can't really tell that there's any stair-steppy things going on with that. So it does look like in the texture I have the sidewalk slanting up right there. So just pull that up, and that gets me that there. So looks like this thing needs to be brought forward just a little bit. Then this can be pulled up right there. And then on these stairs, stairs can be a little bit tricky, but let's see if we can get these to work in our projection here. So that seems to line up okay. So you can tell where this bottom edge, if you pull it back in space, about where it should be, that crease hits in the crease of the image, and that seems like an appropriate distance for steps. So, so that's good. So we'll stick with that. Like right there, you can see how it lines up right there. Now on this guy here, let's lower him down. Get him right about there. So those are our stairs. Looking from this view, you can see how all that's working right now. Send this guy out right there. So let's go look through our shot cam right there and take a look at this stuff. Yeah, so you can see that that's pretty nicely working out right there. You know, I'm getting all the parallax that I expect. And you can see right here on this edge, from this angle, it looks okay. But then when you get in here, you start to see the doubling of this surface on the back of this surface. So that's where, when we talked at the beginning, we knew that we were going to have to get like a real punched-in camera and do a patch. So the patch would be just a little bit of painting right there, just a little tiny paint to fix that, and then project just a little patch back on top of all this geometry. So that way it'll fix all of those problems. So I can see that you know, this curb has the same ultra flat problem, so it's an easy thing to duplicate this guy across and just spin him around so that he'll align better here. That, of course, needs to be lowered down so it's level. And then these guys just shove them off into that thing. So like I said, I'm not really concerned about how the geometry is penetrating each other. That's not really a big concern of mine. So I think you get the basic idea of how these things, how you go back and forth between the Photoshop file and the geometry. Like I said, this thing will have to be fixed over here, the perspective issue on that. And you know, I'm going to create a sky dome or a sky card, not a projection, but like a UV'd object for reference purposes. And because eventually all of this will be in Nuke. So just setting up the basic idea here and then transferring it to Nuke for an easy render projection solution. So I'm going to pause this video right here, and I will keep working on this file, and I will show you the result of our bash. And I think it'll be at that point where we can say the bash is done. We can show it to the director, or whoever it needs to be seen, get their feedback, and then start working on finaling some of these elements and getting them to a final state.